It was a bright Sunday morning. The congregation sang with passion, their voices harmonizing with the choir. Pastor Emmanuel, a man reverend for his charisma and devotion, stood at the pulpit, delivering a powerful sermon about truth and redemption. As the congregation nodded in agreement, a commotion at the back of the hall drew everyone's attention. A woman in her early 30s, holding the hand of a young boy who looked no older than 7, walked steadily to the front. Her voice was clear but shaky. Pastor Emmanuel, before you preach about truth, shouldn't you tell them yours? Gasps echoed through the church. Whispers filled the air as the pastor froze. He stared at the woman, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker. What is the meaning of this? Elder Durojai, a senior church official, demanded, rising from his seat. The woman, tears brimming in her eyes, pointed at the boy. This is David. He's your son, Pastor Emmanuel, and it's time they knew the truth. The boy clung to her shirt, looking around nervously. The silence was deafening as the congregation looked between the woman and their pastor, who stood rooted to the spot, his lips trembling. Let's not create a scene, Pastor Emmanuel finally managed, his voice weak. Sister, I don't know what you are talking about. You don't know me? She exclaimed, her voice rising. You don't remember the night we spent together? The promises you made? Her words cut through the air like a knife, leaving no room for doubt about her accusation. The congregation erupted in chaos. Some demanded answers, others whispered in disbelief. Pastor Emmanuel's wife, seated in front row, looked pale, her eyes darting between her husband and the woman. Please, sister, Emmanuel said, trying to maintain his composure. This is not the time or place. This is the perfect time and place, she interrupted. You taught me about forgiveness, about living righteously. Now practice what you preach, Pastor. Admit the truth. Her voice cracked as she spoke, revealing years of pain. David tugged at her hand, whispering, Mama, let's go home. But the woman stood firm, not until he acknowledged his son. As the tension grew, church leaders tried to calm the situation, but the damage was done. The service ended abruptly, leaving the congregation buzzing with questions. Who was this woman? Was she telling the truth? And if she was, what did this mean for their beloved pastor? Evening after the chaotic service, Pastor Emmanuel sat in his office, his head buried in his hands. His world had crumbled in a single moment. The woman, Sonia, had revealed a truth he had buried deep within him for years. Flashbacks overwhelmed his mind, taking him back to a time when he was a young, ambitious pastor. He had only been a few years into ministry when he first met Sonia, a quiet, beautiful woman who had come to church seeking solace after a painful breakup. She was broken, vulnerable, and he was eager to help her, became her spiritual guide. It started innocently enough. Counseling sessions turned into long conversations after church services, where Emmanuel would listen to her woes, offering prayers and guidance. As time passed, their bond deepened. He found himself drawn to her, something more than just pastoral affection. But Emmanuel was married with a young daughter at home. His vows to his wife, Rachel, and his calling as a pastor held him back until one evening. Sonia had shown up at his house unexpectedly, tearfully confessing that she had no one else to turn to. Emmanuel, I need you, she had whispered, her eyes searching his. He had been weak, vulnerable, and before he knew it, the line between pastor and lover had been crossed. That night, everything changed. Over the next several months, their secret affairs continued. Emmanuel tried to justify it by telling himself that he was helping her heal, that she needed his presence, his understanding. But each lie he told to Rachel, each time he came home late or missed family events, chipped away at the trust in his marriage. Sonia, too, began to grow attached, believing that they were meant to be together. But when Sonia discovered she was pregnant, Emmanuel's world began to crumble. He couldn't risk losing everything he had worked so hard for: his church, his reputation, and his family. He begged Sonia to leave the town and promised to send money for her and the child. But Sonia was not willing to be silenced. She wanted more. She wanted the man who had promised her love, the father of her child, to stand by her. In the end, Emmanuel's guilt overwhelmed him, and he made the decision to cut ties completely. Sonia left the town, raising their son David in solitude, while Emmanuel buried the memory, hoping it would stay forgotten. But now, in the most public way possible, the secret was out. Following the revelation were a blur of panic and regret for Pastor Emmanuel. His once calm and orderly life was now a storm of unanswered questions, suspicious glances, and rising gossip. Sonia's accusation had torn through his reputation like wildfire, and he knew that without a swift, careful response, everything he had built would collapse. As soon as the service ended that fateful Sunday, Emmanuel called a meeting with the church board. His voice was shaky, but his words were firm. "We cannot let this scandal ruin us," he insisted, his eyes darting to his wife, Rachel, who sat silently beside him, her face pale with shock. "We must act quickly," Elder Dorojaye suggested, his voice tight with concern. "Do we know for sure this woman is telling the truth?" Emmanuel hesitated. He knew better than anyone that the truth didn't matter anymore. The mere accusation was enough to destroy his credibility, and the longer it lingered, the more his congregation would turn away. "It doesn't matter," he said quietly. "We need to shut this down before it spreads." The meeting turned into a plan of damage control. The board decided that Rachel would issue a statement to the press, denying any claims about the child. Meanwhile, Emmanuel's lawyer would work with the authorities to ensure that no evidence was found to substantiate Sonia's accusation. At first, Rachel agreed to the plan. She sat beside Emmanuel in front of reporters, offering a public defense of her husband's character. "Pastor Emmanuel is a man of God, and we have no knowledge of this woman's claims," she stated, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. But behind closed doors, Rachel was devastated. Every night she would confront Emmanuel in their bedroom, demanding the truth. "Why didn't you tell me? How could you betray me like this?" Her heart ached as she struggled to make sense of her husband's lies. Emmanuel, however, remained distant, consumed by guilt and fear. "Rachel, I am sorry," he would whisper, his voice hoarse. "I never meant for this to happen." But words no longer seemed to matter. The damage was done, and as the weeks passed, the pressure mounted. Emmanuel started paying off influential members of the community to keep quiet, hoping the scandal would eventually fade. But Sonia wasn't backing down. She began showing up at the church, standing outside with her son David, holding signs that read, "This is your son, Pastor Emmanuel. Will you deny him forever?" The media caught wind of her protests, and soon the church was surrounded by cameras and reporters. As the public pressure grew, Emmanuel's actions became more erratic. He avoided his family and the church, retreating into himself. His faith, which had once been his guiding light, now seemed like a distant memory. He was trapped by his own lies, suffocated by the weight of his secrets. Meanwhile, Sonia's life continued without him. Raising David alone was difficult, but she did it with strength and grace, refusing to let her son grow up without knowing who his father was. One evening, she received a letter from Emmanuel. It was a simple request: "Please meet me in person. Let's resolve this privately." Sonia hesitated. She had waited years for this moment, but now she wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. The evening air was heavy with anticipation as Sonia arrived at the agreed upon meeting spot, a quiet park just outside the city. She clutched the letter in her hand, its contents still fresh in her mind. Emmanuel had promised to meet her to speak the truth. But after everything that had happened, she wasn't sure she could trust him anymore. As she approached the bench, she saw him sitting there, his posture stiff and guarded. Emmanuel stood as she neared, his face a mask of guilt and remorse. "I didn't want it to come to this," he began, his voice low. "I never intended for anyone to know about David." Sonia felt a rush of emotions, anger, betrayal, and a deep aching sadness. "You think you can just sweep this under the rug?" she demanded. "You think you can keep pretending I don't exist? That David doesn't exist?" Emmanuel took a deep breath. "I never wanted this for you or for me, but my position, my life, is too much to lose." "Too much to lose?" Sonia's voice trembled with fury. "What about your son? What about the boy who has been living without a father because you were too afraid to face the truth?" The anger in her voice pierced through the silence, and for the first time, Emmanuel seemed to falter. His eyes fell to the ground as he struggled to find the right words. "I am sorry, Sonia," he said, his voice cracking. "I have tried to make things right, but every time I come close, it feels like everything I have worked for is slipping away." Sonia's heart ached. She had spent so many years waiting for him to acknowledge David, to take responsibility for the child they had created together. But now, as she stood before him, she realized that nothing could ever undo the pain he had caused. Suddenly, the sound of a camera flash broke through the tension. Emmanuel spun around, his face pale as he saw a group of reporters approaching. Sonia had been followed. The truth was about to be exposed to the world. Within moments, the news had spread like wildfire. Sonia's interview aired on national television, and the footage of her standing next to David with Pastor Emmanuel's shocked face behind her became a viral sensation. The scandal was now undeniable. The church was in an uproar. Emmanuel tried to maintain control, but the once adoring congregation had begun to question his integrity. Members of the church board, who had once stood by him, now demanded he step down. Rachel, his wife, watched from the sidelines, her emotions a whirlpool of confusion and pain. The man she had loved, the man she had built her life with, was no longer the person she thought he was. One evening, as Emmanuel sat alone in his office, the weight of the scandal sinking in, he received a call from an anonymous source. "You think you can hide forever? The truth will always find a way to the surface." The voice on the other end hissed. Emmanuel's heart raced, his breath shallow. He was no longer in control. The truth had come to light, and with it, all the lies and deceit he had tried so hard to bury. Church was no longer a place of refuge for Pastor Emmanuel. Once filled with love, faith, and worship, it had become a battleground, one that had seen marriages broken, friendships torn apart, and trust shattered. The news of his secret child had swept through the community like wildfire, and there was no place to hide. The whispers behind closed doors grew louder, the glances sharper. Pastor Emmanuel's congregation, the very people he had preached to for years, no longer saw him as their shepherd. They saw him as a fraud, a man who had deceived them, and a leader unworthy of their respect. Rachel had remained silent, her heart broken, but her anger simmered just below the surface. Their once happy home had become a silent battlefield. Emmanuel, overwhelmed by the guilt and the consequences of his actions, barely spoke to her. Instead, he buried himself in the church, attempting to salvage whatever was left of his ministry. One evening, Emmanuel stood before the empty pulpit. The church, once filled with people, now sat in eerie silence. His heart ached as he looked at the vacant seats that had once been filled with his congregation, his family in Christ. Sonia, too, had been through her own trials. Though she had found the strength to raise David, she couldn't shake the deep scars Emmanuel had left on her. She had hoped at first that he would come back, that he would be the man he promised to be, but she had learned painfully that people often show you who they really are when they think no one is watching. And now, here they were, the man who had once been a symbol of righteousness, and the woman who had borne his child in secret, standing at the crossroads of their separate lives. One rainy afternoon, Emmanuel made a decision. He called a meeting with the church board, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. I have come to realize something, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I have been living a lie. I have been a coward, and I have hurt too many people, especially my family, my wife, my son, and my congregation. Elder Jai, who had once been Emmanuel's greatest supporter, watched him closely. Pastor, we all make mistakes, he said cautiously. But you have always preached about redemption. You can still make it right. But Emmanuel knew deep down that the road to redemption wasn't simple. It wasn't just about asking for forgiveness, it was about proving that he was worthy of it. In the following weeks, he began the long, painful process of rebuilding his life. He publicly admitted his sins, not just to the congregation, but to his family as well. He stood before them, eyes filled with tears, and confessed the truth about his affairs with Sonia and the child he had abandoned. Rachel, he said, voice trembling, I have broken your trust, and I can't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I will spend the rest of my life proving that I am sorry, that I will change. Rachel, though hurt, listened in silence. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but in her heart she understood that forgiveness, even if slow, was the only path to healing. Meanwhile, Sonia made the difficult decision to let go of her anger. Though her heart still carried the scars of Emmanuel's betrayal, she wanted her son David to know his father. She allowed Emmanuel to meet David, who was hesitant at first but slowly began to form a bond with the man who was, despite everything, still his father. Months passed, and slowly Pastor Emmanuel began to earn back the trust of his congregation. He dedicated himself to living a life of transparency, honesty, and humility. His sermons changed, no longer focused on condemnation, but on grace and forgiveness. The journey of redemption wasn't perfect. It was full of missteps, doubts, and pain. But Emmanuel understood that redemption wasn't about erasing his past. It was about learning from it and choosing to do better. The church, though forever scarred by the scandal, began to heal. Some members left, unable to accept the truth about their pastor, but others stayed, understanding that forgiveness was a process and that the road to healing, though long, was worth walking. Emmanuel learned that true redemption was not a destination, but a daily choice. And in that choice, he found the peace he had long been searching for. With this, we have come to the end of the series. I hope you've learned one or two lessons from this story. Please click on the follow button for more interesting series as this.